Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about when it's okay to break the opening principles in chess, or just when it's okay to break principles in general. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So like the principles I'm talking about is like never move your queen out too early. Of course, never lose tempo in the opening. So for example, like e3, e5, e4, this would be a mistake because we're two-stepping our pawn, we're losing tempo. Knights on the rim are dim. Never move your knight to the rim of the board. And I mean, there's a lot of rules like this, and there's a lot of principles like this. But of course, we can break all these principles sometimes, and sometimes we need to. Sometimes we need to break these principles for certain reasons. So a classic example is, let's say they play f3, e5, g4. The move queen to h4 breaks opening principles. We're moving our queen out too early, or moving it to the edge of the board. But of course, queen to h4 is checkmate. So we can always break opening principle if we're hitting checkmate, right? This is the simplest, easiest explanation of when we can break opening principle, and we should break it every single time if we get mate in one. If there's ever a time to break principle, it's to get mate in one. So of course, that's the most concrete reason to break principle. But there's slightly less concrete reasons to break principle. We can often do it to just not checkmate necessarily, but maybe to get a very strong checkmating attack. So for example, let's say that we have something like a King's Gambit, where again, we have an early f-pawn moves. Usually, early f-pawn moves can sometimes be a signal that there might be an opportunity to break principle at some point, because this diagonal becomes very weak, and we need to find some way to jump on this diagonal. But let's say we play like a King's Gambit declined, and then we have like a d6, we have a c3, bishop b6. So far, this is all fairly theoretical. We're just going to have white develop, we're going to have black develop. This all looks very natural. d3, knight f6, and then we're going to have queen e2. This is a move I've actually personally seen people play a lot, with the attempt of playing something like bishop e3, and then we play bishop g4, and then they say, okay, you're pinning my knight to my queen, I'm going to go ahead and play h3. Well, after h3, now is the perfect opportunity to break principle. If you were looking at the computer assessment, it just dropped off the map. Black basically has a winning position at this point. But the way black wins his position is he immediately breaks principle. He takes this knight, and I'm going to turn on the engine here just so you can see the assessment. He takes this knight, and he moves it to the h5 square. That's to basically attack these weaknesses, and to attack this diagonal. So now we're threatening to come in with our queen, we're threatening to come up with win with our knight, we're threatening to win the pawn on f4, and there isn't a good move here, because if, for example, they play h takes g4, we have knight g3, which forks queen and rook, the queen's going to have to move away, and then we simply take this whole rook, and apparently black is completely winning here. So that's a perfect example of where we would break opening principle. We are getting a winning attack, and we are eventually winning a significant amount of material with it. Another signal that we can sometimes break opening principle is when our opponent is breaking opening principle. Like a lot of times, like if our opponent is seriously compromising his own development, like if he plays a move like bishop d3, knight f6, castles, bishop c5, we'll say c3, d6, and we'll just say something like rook e1, a6, and then h3. This could be a huge signal that it might be acceptable to start breaking opening principle ourselves. Because he's broken a lot of principle. He's made a lot of pawn moves. He's made a lot of moves that didn't prepare to attack in the middle of the board. So now it's probably okay for us to even get away with something like g5 and just go after his king. And as you can see, the computer thinks g5 is okay. We can play g5, g4, and we can start attacking his king, and we can start whipping up some sort of kingside attack in this position. I mean, normally it's not a great idea to, thrust our g-pawn up the board early in the opening, but when our opponent has behaved so strangely and made all of these weird moves that didn't finish his development, we can do this to take advantage of the fact that he has a stable center and we know his king's address. So we can break opening principle for that reason. Other times, we really kind of need to break opening principle just to follow opening principle. And this is one of the problems that, of course, strong players come across. And this is one of the difficulties that we have in all kinds of openings, is sometimes we need to break opening principle to follow it. So one situation is in like the Queen's Gambit declined, where we play e6 to defend our pawn. They play knight c3, and now we play the next several moves very efficiently. We play knight f6, which follows opening principle to the letter. We're going to play knight f6, we're going to play bishop e7, and we're going to castle. And the reason we do everything in this order is because we have no idea how we're going to finish the development of our queenside yet. Because right now, it's very difficult to finish the development of our queenside, because white is going to be putting pressure on that queenside with a move like queen b3 if we touch any of these pieces. So like if we play bishop d7, we have to worry about queen b3 at some point, putting pressure on d5 and b7, and that pressure is extremely uncomfortable. So right now, we're just going to finish our development normally, and then when we reach this point, we have to break principle somehow to finish our development, or we have to break principle in the way that maybe a lot of beginners think of principle, which is a lot of beginners look at this position and they say, I've moved my two center pawns. The only way for me to follow principle is to develop these two pieces in the next two consecutive moves. But we can't do that. Because if we develop those two pieces in the next two consecutive moves, we're dropping material. So if we play something like knight c6, and they just play any move, like rook c1, and we play bishop d7, you can notice that the assessment just went way down for black with the assessment on the engine, and that's because white can just play takes, takes, and takes. And we just lost a whole pawn, and we have no compensation. We're down a ton of material for absolutely no reason. So for starters, we can't finish our development without dropping material, but we also can't make this move. We really can't play knight c6 without having to make a whole bunch of moves to still develop this bishop. Because again, bishop d7 is not possible. So we're going to have to make 6 or 7 awkward moves after this weird knight c6 move, just so we can try to develop our bishop later. You know, we're going to have to move this knight again. We're going to have to move a couple more pawns. Then maybe we can move our bishop out. It's very complicated. So we have to make this extra couple of pawn moves. First h6, bishop h5, and then b6. And then once we play b6, now we can just follow opening principle normally. Because we've made this one extra pawn move, and now our development becomes extremely clear. We know that we can put our knight on b7, we know we can put our bishop on b7, and we know we can play c5. So now the development is very clear and very obvious. And this is one of the reasons that this opening, the Tartakower variation, has worked into the repertoire of every single world champion in history. This is one of the reasons I teach this opening to beginners, because this is actually the most principled way that you can possibly develop your pieces against d-pawn openings. And this is just something that you have to do sometimes. You have to make this extra pawn move so that you can finish your development and follow the spirit of opening principle to the closest possible letter. So then there's one more situation where you break principle in the opening to finish your development. So it comes up in openings like the Benoni, where after knight f6, like say c4, c5, and we're going to play some sort of Benoni variation. And I'm going to try to play like not a complex version of it, like f3, bishop g7, bishop e3, castles, and then we're going to have queen d2. So the issue is here, how do you finish your development here? You know, do you play a6? Do you play rook e8? So one of the cool things about this, and it's similar to the QGD, the Queen's Gambit Declined, is that you've castled. So you've solved the biggest problem of your opening. So now you just have to solve the second problem of your opening, which is how do I develop my queenside? So one totally reasonable solution here is to actually take your knight and develop it to the rim. And this is actually okay. You can put your knight on the rim here. And one of the ideas is that these other development schemes that are well known, like rook e8 is actually a well-known development scheme, like rook e8, knight on g to e2, and then a6 followed by knight on b to d7. Your pieces are somewhat still in the way of your other pieces. Your knight on d7 is in the way of your bishop. So it's still awkward to finish your development. So, like, wouldn't your knight be more comfortable on c7 where the bishop has free reign, and furthermore, the knight is supporting b5? And the answer to that is yes, it would. So, a lot of people prefer to spend 2 tempo to get the knight to a better square. You play knight a6, knight on g to e2, knight back to c7, and now this bishop is kind of free-flowing. There's no knight that's in the way, and your knight is free to support a6 and b5. And so this is another perfectly acceptable way that black can play the position. He can play knight a6 to c7 instead of putting his knight on d7, and he can break this rule, bring the knight straight back into the middle, so that he can finish his development, smoothly and cleanly. And these certain types of knight a6 maneuvers in certain situations are totally acceptable, especially if you've already castled and you've already solved this major problem. You can a lot of times get away with putting your knight on the rim temporarily to bring it back to a better square. So those are the situations where you can break principle in chess, and those are the situations where, in some cases, you absolutely should break principle, or like this last example, it's just a situation where you can, but of course you can do it the other way as well. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess. Thank you very much for watching.